All right, hello and welcome to Interpretive Reading, teaching students effective strategies for interpreting authentic text. My name is Fran, Lazette, and this session will briefly discuss strategies and activities that are designed to help novice language learners, and they can use this as their foundation for interpreting authentic text. And it'll also include some example activities that will allow students to monitor their progress and track their targeted strategies for improvement. So a little bit about myself. I have taught kindergarten through 12th grade French, so all levels. I've also taught 7th and 8th grade English language arts. In addition, I have worked in a variety of settings, some schools where French is taken by choice as an elective, in some schools where French was the only elective, or where I am now, all students are required to take a language class. So currently, I am teaching exploratory and level 1 French. And the reason I thought to include my background is that having worked in several different positions has helped me realize the importance of actually teaching interpretive reading skills. And it's had like a pretty solid impact on what my students have been able to accomplish. So I know what you're thinking, but I'm not an English teacher. I don't know the strategies. I don't have the background. I can't teach kids how to read. But essentially, if you're going to be asking the kids to read, you're going to have to be a reading instructor. But the good news is it is not as awful as it sounds. You simply just need to stop and think about the strategies you use every day as a reader and point that out to your kids, right? Just being more mindful of what you expect the students to do and do what you can to help them get there. So, a couple of key things to remember. First, assume no prior knowledge. Something I learned when I was teaching ELA is that kids are just constantly reviewing and revisiting the same skills that they've been using for years. So things that I just thought the kids would already know how to do or be aware that they were doing, they had no idea, right? Also be aware that students will come to you with varying reading levels and skill sets. So even though they are in the 9th grade, the 10th grade, they might not be reading or have the reading skills that you would assume students would have at that point. And then finally, or second, if you think students should be actively using certain strategies, it's definitely best to explicitly teach those strategies at least a few times. And then finally, just make sure you pick probably one thing to focus on at a time. Otherwise, if you just come at the kids often with like 100 things to do, they'll freak out, you'll freak out, and it'll be a mess. So, first thing we're going to talk about are introducing interpretive reading strategies to your students. So these are things that you can do. So at the beginning of each school year, I will explicitly teach interpretive reading strategies. I will tell the kids what interpretive reading is, what they are expected to do, and then I will introduce a whole bunch of strategies for the kids to use. We will start off by taking guided notes. We will model all the different strategies as a class, and I will come back to the same strategies. I'll use common language throughout the entire year. And so this right here is the list of strategies I give to my students. Again, this is for novice level learners. If you're working with intermediate level students, you might change a few up on your own, but just this is great for those new kids just starting out. So basic ones, look at the pictures, look at the title and the headings and the bold words. As readers, we do this all the time and you get a lot of information from it, but kids don't actually do that all the time. Using cognates and or unit vocabulary to help them figure out what's going on. Cognates are a great resource, and then unit vocabulary is more helpful once the terms progress. Using charts, graphs, and numbers are fantastic because a pie graph looks the exact same no matter what language you're in, so that's helpful for kids, that familiarity. Looking for clues in the questions and or the answers is a big one for students. Don't try to translate word by word. This is a big problem for a lot of kids at the beginning because they get caught up on the fact that they don't know everything, and then they shut down, and just teaching them, don't go word by word, just look for what you do know. And then the next one's pretty big. Skip it and hope it's not important. I always tell my kids that if you don't know what a word is, just hop over it and hope that you never see it again, and sometimes if you don't see it again, then maybe it wasn't so important, and if that word does come up a few more times, then perhaps you need to try to establish meaning at some point, right? And that's where the next one comes in handy, making inferences, using what you do know to answer questions about what you don't know. And then the last one we use to kind of ensure active reading participation is talking to the text strategies. And I'll explicitly explain that one later on in the presentation. So that is the list that I show my students, and I will project and reference those strategies on the board before every interpretive reading activity we do. So right in the bottom corner here is just a screenshot of one of the slides I used at the start of the year. And I would just copy the slide and paste it in whenever we're doing interpretive reading. And the students, the more they see this same vocabulary, the easier it is for them to learn what I'm asking them to do or what strategies they should be using. And then sometimes I will assign the students a specific strategy to focus on. And then depending on later in the term, I'll just have the students leave it up to them. What are you working on currently? Focus on that for this task. Okay, so that is what I do as a teacher. And then, so these are some readings for my students, and then these are some strategies that you can use when you are designing your assessments. So one thing that's important, now that the kids have their strategies, you want to make sure that your activities offer the students the time to revisit those strategies, and you want to make sure that your activities are set up to encourage good interpretive reading habits. And what I mean by that is reading occurs in 3 parts. This was something that I just kind of didn't think about or didn't remember until I taught ELA. So reading occurs in 3 parts: what you do before reading, what you do during reading to ensure that you're comprehending stuff as you go through, and then you kind of check yourself, your comprehension, with the questions you answer afterwards. And it's important as a teacher to make sure you create activities that acknowledge all 3 parts of this process. And for myself, I always found I was always focused on the after reading questions, the comprehension parts after, to see if you understood what you were reading. And I wasn't necessarily focusing on the entire process. So this has been very helpful for me in kind of ensuring that my kids are doing what they need to do throughout the reading activity so that they can be successful in the after reading parts. So before reading, one strategy that I always talk to my students about is called previewing the text, right? Before you read something, you should preview it. This helps your brain know what you are going to read about, and it helps you identify key components of the reading. Seems pretty simple, has a big impact, but students just don't do this, right? Students just don't even read the directions, they don't read unit overviews, they really just try to start to do the reading and the text, and then they hope that everything comes together by the end, right? And so if you make previewing the text part of your activity and you model it as a class, and you write questions that require students to preview the text, then they will. Right? You got to kind of trick them into it. So here is an example of writing questions that require students to preview. So this is just like a little basic infographic. I use it with exploratory. And then, so question 1 is, what pictures do you see? I tell them they need at least 2. And this forces the students to look around and figure out what pictures they can find, right? Here's a calendar with a 1. Here's an Easter basket. Here's some fireworks, right? And so there's the lady relaxing. So they have to find and describe 2 pictures. Then I ask them to identify cognates and find at least 3 of them in the text. And especially at the beginning levels, I always remind them what a cognate is, right? So for my class, cognates are French words that look like an English word. Or a lot of times too, I'll have students, the French word will look similar to the Spanish, and I tell them that works just as well. Here is another example. So I had the kids had a handout, an article to read, and question 1, before you begin reading, preview the text using that same vocabulary to build familiarity. And I remind them, look at the title, the pictures, the bold words, etc. What do you think this article will be about, right? So they have to look at all the big things and make a prediction. And then again, going back to cognates, cognates are a great asset, especially in the Romance languages. You have a lot of vocabulary that goes between the languages. So it's helpful for students to get a little confidence in what they're doing before they begin answering questions. And then finally, for previewing the text, this was a specific skill I would have the students do at the start, asking them to identify the main idea. So I would just post, 10 infographics around my room, and the kids would wander around and look at them, and they would have to just simply make a guess. What is this infographic about? And list 2 reasons why you made your guess, right? So, and since they don't really have any vocabulary for these, they literally would have to go around and just do the simple previewing the text, where they would look at the title, they would look for cognates, they would look at the pictures and try to come up with what each thing was talking about. So there weren't any other questions aside from having them do this main idea thing, which requires them to preview the infographic. And then finally, depending on what levels you're going with, if you're a little higher up, you could ask your students what type of text they were reading. Is it expository, a narrative, persuasive? Was it a newspaper article, an infographic, or something from a website, right? And you ask them to identify what type of text it is, and then tell me how you know that, offering 2 pieces of evidence. So that's, again, maybe for your higher levels, or maybe, if you're doing something simple like infographic or website, you could use this with the newbies. Okay, so before reading, they previewed the text. They've got an idea of what they're going to be reading about, what the article is, or what the actual type of text is. And then while they're reading, you want to try to make sure they are engaged. So a strategy we use at my school is called Talk to the Text. And this asks students to take notes as they read. And so here are some things they could do. They can do any of these things or all of these things, up to you guys where you're at. So first thing is they could just simply write down notes in the margin, right? We have to remind the kids, though, that notes are just short, simple phrases. They should not be translating word for word. So you can have your students write questions along the side where they get confused or where they don't know what's going on. You can have them underline key words or phrases that they recognize throughout, perhaps unit vocab. They can circle unfamiliar words that seem important. Kind of goes back to where we talked about skipping it and hoping it's not relevant. And then if the word keeps coming up and they can't figure it out, have them circle it. And then finally, I tell my students that if you have to translate something, like you get something from your notes or you have me come over and tell you what something means, they should write that translation down next to the word. That way, the next time they come across it, they can just reference their own notes in their paper. And so this strategy is great because it helps make sure the kids are actively reading, not just reading the words without comprehending what they're reading. And I always tell the kids, I always relate it to them. I remember as a student that I would, open my history book or my science book, and I would read the entire chapter word for word, and I'd get to the end and realize that I had read every single word, but I didn't actually put anything together, right? I was reading, but I was not comprehending. So if you have your students do talk to the text strategy, this will help make sure that they're putting the pieces together. Another during the reading strategy, so this is kind of more for the infographics, is showing your students how to find clues in the questions or the answers, right? So this one's pretty rough at the beginning, actually modeling it for the students because it seems very, very simple, but you're gonna have a lot of students who just don't have this skill set quite developed. So this one here says, based on the range provided in the infographic, are you a millennial? Right? And the kids are like, well, what's a millennial? And I'm like, well, I don't know. Figure it out, buddy. Like, that's literally the question. And so I've told my students, if I ask you a question about a word and I've never taught you that word, that must mean it's a cognate. So then you just scan the document for a word that looks enough like millennial. So they go around, find it over here. And then next to it, it has 18-30. And I currently teach 7th graders. So hopefully, no, you are not a millennial, right? Another example would be, based upon the principal advantages list, which app is best for job recruitment? So they have to look around for something that resembles principal advantages down here. And it says, which app is best for job recruitment? So again, this is a list and the kids are familiar with lists and like categories set up like this. So they scan it and look for something that looks like job recruitment right here. Then they go up to find out what app it is. LinkedIn, they don't even know what LinkedIn is, but they know that IN is not the one for Facebook and it's not for Twitter, right? And then one more here was just showing the kids numbers and how big of a of an asset those are. So the question says 76% of people. So the kids see 76, they look for 76 in the text, they find it. You look around it, scan around it. The only thing near it says restaurant, and they look around here. And even though restaurant is not an answer choice, you can infer going out to eat would be a logical choice. So again, seems pretty awful to have to go through and do this, but especially with your, first year level 1 or exploratory students, they maybe kind of have these skills, but they won't have the confidence to use them in a new language. You have to show them that they are totally capable of it, that it is super easy to do. You just kind of have to hold their hand for a minute, right? And then another one that I will do for during reading is having them justify their responses. So this was a resource I purchased online, so you can't totally steal it, but I'll have the kids, does the girl like the boy? Give evidence to support your answer. So they have to say their reason and then find something in here to kind of supports it, right? Question 1 up here, who is athletic, the girl or the boy? And they have to circle the word in the reading that helped them determine their answer, right? So they can't just make up something. They can't just say, oh, it's the boy, right? Because of the boy athletic, right? They have to go through and find out where it says that. So having them justify their answers kind of has them going and looking back at what they were doing and being a little more attentive. And then after reading, always the easiest one, you come up with their questions about what they had just read and stuff. But one thing I try to do is, try to do a couple different ways for them to give me their answers. Sorry, that was rough. So just being very intentional the first few times that you're trying a new skill. And so modeling kind of like what I had just discussed, as when you discuss the answers and how you found that answer. At the beginning, it's really important that you do this. I'll usually try to project the activity and just visually show the thought process as I go through. Group work is a great one. Sometimes kids don't want to listen to me talk all the time, unfortunately. And so having the students work together to answer the questions will be super helpful, because sometimes too there will be things that the students can explain different than how I would, and it just clicks better for the other kids. And then surprise group paper. So my classroom is always set up in groups, so a lot of my stuff will just be easily done in groups. But this one here is surprise group paper, where I will have everyone working on an activity alone. And then I will pretend like the groups are just going to submit one response paper. So all the students will have to make sure that their answers are exactly the same as everyone else. So whichever person's paper I go around and grab from their group as the representative, that everyone's okay with the answers that that person has. And what this does is this forces the kids to discuss all of their answers and see if there's any discrepancies, right? So if they all had the same answers for 1, 2, and 3 before they had different, they would have to work together and explain to each other how they came to their answers that they had. And then hopefully their group can figure out the correct one, right? And then think, pair, share is a pretty common one, where the kids just work alone. Then you allow them to compare their responses with a partner to kind of process things, to ask each other questions about what they found difficult or what they were stuck on. And then we will share out with the entire class as we correct an activity together. So again, don't always just collect the papers and grade them and give them back to the kids. Give them the opportunity to see the process, how to find the answers or how to get through the things. And if it's not from me modeling it, have it be from their peers, where they do group work or surprise group work or I think pair share. And then again, just make sure you name the specific strategies you are using as you're discussing the answers, and then identify the name of the strategy so that kids can get used to hearing the terminology. And then another pro tip, which I've actually gotten much better with the past few years, is talking to your peers. So go outside of your language department and try to use similar activities and templates as the other teachers at your school, right? Try to teach similar strategies as other content areas. So if you find that you're teaching a lot of reading, go to your ELA department and ask them what they are focusing on right now. Are they doing inferences this term? Are they showing the kids, are they working on, identifying reputable news sources and stuff like that? So a lot of, expository text, and you can do the same thing in your class, right? And so there were a lot of things that I started using in my classroom that was the result of what other teachers were using in my building. And so finally, so this kind of goes along with it, right? So when you're doing your after reading questions, when you're creating the questions that the kids can show you they understood what they were doing, reinforce skills from other classes. So maybe you can ask them, what was the main idea, right? You can complete character analysis activities if that's what they're doing in their other classes. This is a big one I started doing, was identify a claim made in the article and underline a sentence to support it. This year I found out that like half my school was doing claim evidence reasoning. They were taught it in their ELA class, and they started using the same model in their science and in their social studies classes. And I was like, well, let's throw it into French and really mess with the kids. And it was great because they were already familiar with that structure and with those templates. So I didn't have to teach it to them. They were just applying those skills in a different context. True and false questions are always great, where students will have to correct the questions that are false. You can do a plot diagram. We'll go over that one in case you have repressed those memories from your childhood. And then making connections to the text. So this one's great too. You can have the students connect the text to their own life experiences. They can connect the text to something else that they have read, something they have seen, or something they have learned about in a different class. Or you could have them connect the text to the world, something they just know in general, right? And so those are the different strategies. Those are the ways to include good interpretive reading strategies in your work. And then here are some different activities you can have your students do to help demonstrate their understanding in different ways, right? Instead of just always asking questions and answering questions, these are different structures that you can use. So the first one you can do, I love to do, is a good old gallery walk, right? Where you post information around the room and the kids will have their questions on a handout, or maybe they'll just be doing the same generic task for the entire activity. And then you just have your students wander around, right? And they can answer the questions alone on a piece of paper. They can work with a partner and come up with their answers. They can work in a small group. And you can also switch it up depending on what your focus is, where you can have the students write their responses, or you can have them say their responses with a partner. So that's always fun too, if they don't want to, if you're not focused, maybe if you're focusing on production of the language, they can work together just doing it as an oral activity. So that one's great too, especially if you have wiggly kids, or you find that everyone's like kind of sleepy that day, you just have them roam around the room and it just gets a little more energy out as well. Another activity to do is where students put sentences in order. So you can use sentences from a story you have done in class. You can create a series of sentences from a video that you've watched or a movie you just finished. You can simply just make up a logical series of events as well. So it doesn't matter where they come from. And then the students will just take the sentences and put them in the correct order, right? Seems pretty simple. A couple different ways you can do that. You can just have them projected on the board or something and have the students write them out. You can do cut and paste, where the students just cut the strip off and then put the tabs in the correct order. You can put the pieces in order, like you can have, like I can give them, like I said, my kids are in groups, so you can give them a stack of sentences and the kids will have to put the pieces in the correct order, and the teacher will just wander around and check them when the group has said they're done. And then for that one, a key thing that's helpful too, if you have a handful of groups in your room, I make my copies on a different colored paper for each table. So that way when a strip of paper gets lost eventually, on the floor, or someone drops their pile, you can just, which pile it goes with because of the color of the paper. And then finally, if cutting and pasting in paper strips sounds like a nightmare, which I understand, you can have all the sentences typed up onto an activity, and the students will just write the number next to the sentence. So like sentence number 1 happened first, sentence 2, sentence 3. So they can do it that way too if you don't like the idea of cutting things. Story diagram, plot diagram, super easy to do. Same thing as the last one. You just use your vocab, like a CI story or a movie that you've watched in class, and you come up with the sentences and you have the students cut and paste them or write those sentences on the plot diagram in the correct order. A couple things real quick. My students find it reassuring if I write the number of strips or sentences that will go next to each part of the plot diagram. So the exposition is just 1, rising action for this one was 5 strips, climax was 1, following action was 1, resolution was 1. It's really just 1 on all of them except for the rising action, but the kids just really enjoyed to see the number next to it. It makes them feel better, right? One more pro tip for this one, though, is don't use a story diagram if they haven't used a story diagram yet that year, right? One thing I found out, my term 1 students, like, story diagram was a nightmare because they had no idea what anything was, and then term 3 was super easy because they had already covered them in their language arts class. So before you throw this beast out, maybe just make sure that they have seen it in English first. Fill in the blank, always super easy. You just restate something from the story or the movie, and students will fill in the blank with a word that works there. A lot of times it's better too if you have a blank where maybe more than one word fits there, and it's interesting to see what the kids will come up with, what they can make work there. But one thing that's important is to make sure that you don't type the sentence word for word. Like, don't go back to your story, find a sentence, copy it down, and then remove a word, because the students will just go back and find that sentence in the text and fill in the missing word. So that doesn't necessarily assess their comprehension of it. That just assesses their ability to go back and find it in the original document. So make sure you have paraphrase stuff is really important. And then one of my favorites always is having the students draw a picture to represent a sentence. I love drawing activities because the kids don't feel like they're actually working, when in reality they're still demonstrating that they translated the sentence or the activity. They just get the chance to draw it out and be creative. And I always let them know, like, I'm not going to grade you based on the quality of your art. Your grade will be based on if you included everything from the sentence, so I know you understood it. But I will judge you based on the quality of your art, because that's my favorite part of the drawing activities, right? And then sometimes too, again, it'll just be from the story that we just read or watched. And then sometimes when you're doing your new vocabulary for your unit, right, and you're just trying to mix it up and I make like weird sentences too. So like, the girls sing really badly at the cafe, right? Or I eat dinner alone with my cat in the evening, right? So the kids have to read these absurd sentences and then draw them. And so it's always definitely a fun activity for the kids. Matching, good old fashioned matching, right? And the tons of different things that you can do with these activities. So students could match the character to what they said or did in the story or the movies. They can match a picture to the text. They can match questions to the answers, always an easy one. You can have them match a description to a character. You can have them match a description to an image. So just throw out a ton of unit vocab and they have to decide which picture that one is actually describing, right? And depending on how good they are at the reading, right, it could be something where it's a smaller detail, right? The farther you are into the year, the more descriptive your paragraph. It could be going from one sentence at the beginning of the year to maybe a sentence using a negation, or maybe a short paragraph, right? And something too I like to do where the kids get the chance to move around is where you can give students a description or a text, and they will need to match up with someone else in the classroom who has the answer, right? So maybe one is a description of a character and they have to find the person in the room who has that character, and then they partner up, right? So it's a very simple one, but it gets the kids moving and listening to other people talking, or they have to read the other person's thing and they have to decide if that one is the correct one. So again, I try to encourage a lot of movement in the classroom. True or false? Super simple, right? Create the true or false question from their reading. And something I like to do is if the answer is false, they have to show me why it is false, right? Sometimes you can just have them correct it. So for this example, it asks if Easter is in March, and it turns out Easter was in April that year, so they have to cross off March and write the word April. That one kind of piggybacks into the next one, which is where you have students justify their answers to a question, right? So this one's great because it helps prevent random guessing, right? Students can't just say the answer is 7. They have to explain how they found the answer was 7, with something in the text, right? So like I just said, you could have them explain what makes the answer false. You can have students correct the sentence. You can have them circle the word in the story that helped them come to their conclusion, or circle the picture or the information from the infographic that helps prove their answer. You can ask them to underline or highlight answers in the text. Sometimes I'll give each group a pack of multicolored highlighters and say, highlight this question in pink, highlight the answer to this question in blue, highlight the answer to this one in green. You could do the same thing with underlining it with colored pencils, stuff like that. And so it makes it seem like it's more interesting, but in reality, they're just showing you that they can read it, right? And then sometimes too, I will have my students explain any inferences or connections that they made in English, especially at the novice level. Sometimes the kids can figure it out and make the connections, but their understanding of the language, their command of it, is just not there yet. So if you tried to have them explain stuff in a different language, they couldn't do it. But if you have them explain it in English, they're doing all of the work and it just seems easier to them. And then finally, always something super simple, having them make a prediction, right? Put a break in the text and ask questions throughout. Maybe pause your story and ask for predictions. And then simply just having the students make a guess about what they think will happen shows that they are engaged, helps you know that they're understanding what they're reading. And I always tell them too, you'll never get marked down for an incorrect prediction, right? As long as it's on task. If our story is about goats and your answer is about like turtles or something, right? Then of course you're missing something, right? But as long as your prediction is relevant, you'll always get the points, okay? And so one more thing too, I find myself sometimes getting stuck in an authentic text rut, right? Where I'm like, oh, infographics, these are fantastic. And then anytime I do anything, I'm just searching for another infographic and I'm not keeping it spicy enough for the kids, right? They get bored. So these are a couple different places you can look to find authentic text in your target language. So social media is great. You can search for things via like Instagram posts. You can follow specific accounts. You can look up hashtags. You can do hashtags on Twitter or on Instagram where perhaps you're talking about a holiday or current events or something like that. And you can just search it up by that and you'll find so many authentic resources. And I'll usually just end up screenshotting them because my school blocks all of that stuff. But if you screenshot them and then put them into your stuff at home, then it's no problem, right? Wikipedia, good old reliable right there. Seems like a terrible idea, but it has so much information you can use and it's written at such a basic level that it is very helpful. You can go directly to monument websites and just screenshot information from that. You'd be surprised at how much you can get from like a simple, like if you go like the Eiffel Tower website, they will always have the price, the weather, the day of the week on it, like simple things like you can use for a calendar talk, in a really easy to read, interesting thing. You can follow certain blogs or go to celebrity websites. Infographics, again, are just the most fantastic resource, especially at the novice level. Little kid books can also be really fun. They can also be really weird though, so those hit or miss with those. News articles are really great. You can find them scaffolded too based on grade level or age level is good. Websites for kids in the target language are fantastic. And then finally, like teacher paid teacher stories are great. They're not authentic, but a lot of times you can find them and they're great for those beginning reading activities where you want the kids to read more than just an infographic or more than just a couple sentences. These are great because they're usually leveled and geared towards the students, right? So here's a couple examples. So again, Wikipedia, I'll always use those for my Music Mercredi activities where I will have the kids do a reading about the artist we're going to listen to. You have Instagram, you can follow the Louvre Museum and they'll post pictures. It shows you, we can do memes. Here's posters for Carnival, old commercials, teachers pay teachers. So again, all of these are reading, but it doesn't feel the same as like opening a textbook and having to read like the same passage that was typed up, by the textbook company. And so finally, having the students monitor their own progress and keeping track of their feedback, right? So instead of just me being in charge of all of their learning, helping them take a little ownership in the process. So the main thing is that it is important for students to see the connection between their progress on a skill, right? If everything they do is disconnected, they aren't able to identify their own strengths and weaknesses. So if they don't know that they did poorly on a reading before and now they're doing really well on it, they won't kind of see that connection. They won't notice their own growth, okay? So one thing I do is at the beginning of the term. It's not for the whole time because the novelty would for sure wear off and I would forget about it too. But at the beginning, I will have students track their scores on their interpretive reading activities. And then I will have them pay attention. So like, if you look at your score on task 1, and then task 2, is your score improving? If it is, that's awesome, right? If your score is staying the same, what are you doing to try to improve? Right? And if your scores are getting worse, what's happening? Like, I made you a worse reader in my class. That's a bummer, eh? But so these are the things, like if you have the kids track their scores on interpretive reading tasks, they'll kind of see if they're making the progress they need to make, right? And so this paper right here is actually the strategies for interpretive reading guided notes that I talked about doing at the start of the term. So this is my exploratory one. We only focus on 5 strategies at the beginning. Right? But then we'll do our first task, they write their score down. And the next time we do an activity, I'll tell them, hey, get out your interpretive reading page, your guided reading notes. We're going to write down our score for task 2, right? And then we talk about what their scores are. And then another thing I have my students do is I have them keep track of their feedback, because this helps them remember what skill they should be focusing on. And so their feedback for this, again, this is just at the beginning of the term. I don't do this every single time for the entire year because, again, by November, they should be pretty solid on it, right? And so at the bottom of this page, I have some feedback that they can use. And these are just generic skills that I noticed my kids were needing to use over making their errors with. And so it's just like, take your time, right? Slow down, read the questions or read the directions more carefully, especially with like middle school. That one could be circled every time about everything they do, right? Slow down, buddy, read carefully. Having the students preview the text before they read. I'll throw in questions with like false cognates, where my answer choices have false cognates that are just completely absurd. And you can tell if the kids have previewed the text or not based on what they had chosen as that answer. Okay, having the kids use pictures and graphs to make inferences. Sometimes kids just skip over the pictures and you're like, that's the easiest way to get information, friends. Having them identify and use cognates. Sometimes the kids, especially at the start of the year, don't have the confidence to use cognates or to rely on them. So just getting them to trust themselves and their instincts is pretty huge. Eliminating answers that they know are wrong. That one's kind of just a good test-taking skill in general. I remind them, cross them off as you're working. That's totally fine. And then for my written questions, always having them reminding them, add a specific detail from the infographic or give an example of your connection to the infographic. I always ask the students to make a connection to what they read. And so just kind of making sure they know how to make a good connection or how to make a good explanation of their connection. And then the last 2 is look at all the answer choices before making a guess. And then finally, find clues in the question to locate the answer. Again, that goes back to being a good test-taking skill, and it goes back to the modeling that we do at the start of the year, but having them just slow down and use what they do know to figure out what they don't know. And then sometimes too, right here is whenever we get ready to do our next interpretive reading activity, I will put something on the top of their paper, or I will project something on the board, telling them what the strategy is that they should be using. So a lot of times at the beginning of the year, I will give them a strategy that they're focusing on, like ignore the words you don't know, right? Don't panic, just do the best you can, right? But after we've done a few activities and the kids have kind of leveled them, figured some things out, I'll just put a square at the top of their paper and they'll have to write what their strategy is. So going back to the feedback from before, if your strategy that you're keeping track of is, finding clues in the questions, or maybe it's take your time and read the directions better, right? They'll have to write that on their paper here, do their activity, and then at the bottom I'll ask them, did you use your feedback? Did you remember to do that, right? So it keeps it fresh in the kids' mind what they should be doing, and also helps them, check themselves. Am I doing what I'm supposed to be practicing? So that's it, pretty much, right? So to kind of recap, the interpretive reading strategies, the first thing is make sure you are explicit in your instruction. Break everything down step by step. Model the strategies for your students. Don't assume they know anything, because they don't, or they tend, even if they do know it, they freak out when it's in a different language, right? And so unfortunately, it is a lot of work up front, and it seems pretty rough, but it's definitely worth it in the end, because your workload is reduced throughout the year, and you will see the benefits almost immediately with your kids, who benefit from that first time of seeing you model the way to find the answers, or to make the inferences, or to find cognates, or to look around stuff. Like, it's rough. You have to be intentional, but it's super, super worth it, right? And then being intentional with your activities. Make sure you ask questions that require use of targeted skills, kind of like previewing the text. Make them do that, right? Repeat strategy language to build familiarity throughout the year, okay? And then it's not really cheating, but using structures from other content areas. Have your kids do activities where you don't have to teach them the strategy. They already know it from another class. They're just applying that same skill to your language. And then variety, right? Use a bunch of different text sources. Use different methods for demonstrating their understanding. Don't always have them answering questions. Let them draw it. Let them match it. Let them do a group activity, stuff like that. And then finally, help students make connections and identify their strengths and their trends in their learning. And again, that takes a little bit of the responsibility off of you and helps them figure out what they're doing and if they're doing better. So I hope the session was helpful, and that you can take at least 1 or 2 activities back to your classroom in the fall. Thank you very much.